Have you ever wondered why men, though often seen as creatures of simplicity and desire, carry a secret depth that even they rarely speak of? A hidden place of pleasure, not written in anatomy textbooks, not spoken of in casual conversations, but residing in the silent spaces where body and psyche meet. To discover it is to realize that male intimacy is not as obvious as the world makes it seem, and that the true key lies not in technique, but in understanding the unspoken language of his vulnerability. Male pleasure has long been defined through the narrow lens of the obvious, as though a man's capacity for intimacy and sensation were nothing more than the predictable mechanics of his body. What is rarely acknowledged is that there exists a hidden sensitivity beyond the obvious, one that cannot be reduced to the crude outlines of biology or anatomy. It is a sensitivity that lives in the tension between body and psyche, in the liminal space where touch is not only a physical encounter but a symbolic one. To speak of this hidden pleasure spot is to recognize that a man's experience of intimacy is far deeper than instinct, that beneath the surface lies a layer of profound receptivity most women are never taught to see. This sensitivity is not about the crude intensity of desire, but about the quiet vulnerability that reveals itself when the protective walls of masculinity are lowered, when the body is not a fortress but a field open to subtlety, to gentleness, and to a recognition that transcends the physical act itself. When we think of male pleasure, our collective imagination often reduces it to the obvious biological drives, ignoring that men too carry a secret language in their bodies, one that whispers through places overlooked, unacknowledged, and underestimated. This hidden sensitivity is more than just flesh responding to stimulation. It is a symbolic opening, a doorway into parts of the male psyche rarely granted permission to exist in intimacy. It is where his conscious identity, with all its rigid expectations, meets the unconscious desire to be accepted in a state of surrender. A man may not even consciously know of this sensitivity, for society trains him to harden, to endure, to pursue, but rarely to allow himself to be discovered, to be touched in the places that remind him he is not only strength, but softness, not only control, but yielding. This unknown pleasure spot reveals that intimacy for a man is not one-dimensional, but layered, nuanced, and deeply tied to the psyche's unspoken needs. It is an invitation to realize that men, though often presented as creatures driven by obvious appetites, harbor within them a need for recognition that transcends the act of sex itself. Touching this sensitivity, whether physically or emotionally, communicates a message far greater than pleasure. It communicates safety, the unspoken permission to let go of control without fear of being diminished. It is not a matter of stimulating nerves alone, but of stimulating the deep unconscious yearning to be seen not as an object of expectation, but as a whole being with vulnerabilities. The hidden pleasure spot represents the union of vulnerability and sensation, a truth that runs counter to the mask men are often forced to wear. For many men, the ability to acknowledge this sensitivity requires an undoing of years of conditioning, where pleasure is portrayed as linear, mechanical, and shallow. Beneath this conditioning lies a different reality, that male intimacy, when fully realized, is as subtle and as delicate as any other, that a man's hidden sensitivity carries with it a profound truth. Pleasure for him is not just in the release, but in the recognition of his humanity. This spot, hidden in plain sight, is both physical and symbolic, for it awakens only when touched with an awareness that his pleasure is not a demand to perform, but an invitation to exist authentically. In truth, the hidden sensitivity is not something that can be reduced to a location or mapped like a territory. It is a dimension, a state of openness that exists only when the masculine is allowed to disarm itself. Women who discover it are not merely learning about the male body. They are learning about the male soul. They are discovering that men, despite their exterior of resilience and their reputation for simplicity and intimacy, contain oceans of depth that are revealed only when approached with patience and care. The sensitivity is hidden not because it is invisible, but because it is ignored, bypassed in the rush to reduce pleasure to what is most obvious. Yet those who slow down, who listen not only with their hands but with their presence, find that there is more to male desire than the world has told them. To awaken this sensitivity is to understand that intimacy is a dialogue, not a performance. The male body speaks in its silences, in its subtle reactions, in the quiet surrender that comes when he feels not only desired, but safe to be fully himself. This is the essence of the hidden spot women do not know about, not because it does not exist, but because few have been willing to look past the mask of simplicity that society has painted on men. When it is finally acknowledged, when it is touched with both physical gentleness and emotional awareness, it transforms intimacy from something mechanical into something transcendent, where pleasure is no longer just an act, but a revelation of truth, a glimpse into the delicate and often unspoken core of the masculine being. The male body, though often portrayed as straightforward in its responses, carries within it a complexity that is rarely acknowledged. And nowhere is this more evident than in the relationship between pleasure, trust, and safety. Men are conditioned to appear as though desire is automatic, unthinking, and detached from deeper emotional landscapes. Yet the truth is that the deepest and most hidden layers of male arousal cannot be accessed without the foundation of emotional security. What most women are unaware of is that the most intimate, the most secretive pleasure points in a man's body and psyche remain dormant unless he feels that he is safe, that his vulnerability will not be used against him, and that his surrender will be met with understanding rather than judgment. This is why male intimacy, though often misrepresented as purely physical, is in fact dependent on subtle emotional cues that allow him to lower the defenses he has been trained all his life to maintain. From an early age, men are taught that strength means restraint, that masculinity is proven through control, endurance, and the ability to suppress any sign of weakness. In this cultural narrative, pleasure becomes reduced to a performance, something that is pursued quickly and expressed without delicacy, as though male intimacy was simply a biological demand rather than a layered experience. But behind this mask lies a different truth, that men are as sensitive, as capable of delicate and profound responses as anyone else, and that this sensitivity is locked away not because it does not exist, but because it requires trust to reveal itself. When a woman approaches a man with genuine acceptance, without ridicule or the pressure of expectation, she creates an atmosphere where his defenses begin to soften. This softening is not just emotional, it is physiological. His nervous system relaxes, his body becomes more open to subtle sensations and areas of hidden sensitivity, those overlooked places that hold the potential for extraordinary pleasure, become alive in ways they never could under tension or fear. The role of safety in male pleasure cannot be overstated. The body is inseparable from the mind, and if the mind feels threatened, judged, or inadequate, the body closes itself off to deeper experiences. A man who feels pressured to perform, who fears ridicule, or who carries shame about his desires cannot surrender fully to pleasure, and thus the hidden pleasure spot remains concealed, not by anatomy, but by the psyche's insistence on protection. Yet when he feels trusted and safe, when he senses that he is not merely being used for his physicality, but cherished for his whole self, he allows access to the most delicate layers of his being. Pleasure then is not merely mechanical stimulation, but an emotional awakening, an integration of body and psyche that can only occur in the presence of genuine trust. For many men, The idea of surrender is terrifying, not because they do not desire it, but because surrender requires letting go of the control that society has told them defines their masculinity. To reveal a hidden pleasure spot, to allow a woman access to the most vulnerable and intimate places of their body, is to risk the possibility of shame, ridicule, or rejection. This fear lingers in the unconscious, shaping the way they respond to intimacy and making them hide the very sensitivity that could transform their experience. It is only when trust is firmly established that this barrier dissolves, and when it does, pleasure becomes something far greater than physical gratification. It becomes a moment of being seen without the armor, of being accepted without condition. Trust functions here as a key that unlocks more than sensation. It opens the unconscious doorway to a man's hidden need to be received fully, to exist in intimacy not as a performer, but as a human being with depths and vulnerabilities. When a woman touches him with patience, when she listens to his silence and recognizes the subtle shifts in his body language, she sends a message that he does not need to hide, that his surrender will not be mocked or diminished. This message, more than the act itself, allows the hidden pleasure spot to emerge, because his body now feels that it is safe enough to respond in ways it would never dare under tension. Thus, the connection between male pleasure and safety reveals a profound psychological truth. Men, like women, cannot experience the fullness of intimacy without trust. Their hidden sensitivities, the overlooked pleasure spots that hold the deepest potential, are guarded fiercely by the unconscious, waiting for the rare moment when safety and acceptance are strong enough to disarm the barriers built by culture and fear. In such a moment, the man is no longer merely a body responding to touch, but a whole being surrendering to connection, where the hidden is revealed not by force or demand, but by the quiet assurance that in the presence of another, he is finally safe to be completely himself. For men, pleasure is never merely about sensation, as though the body could exist in isolation from the identity that animates it. Pleasure is intimately woven into how a man perceives himself, how he believes he is seen, and how willing he is to step beyond the boundaries of the roles he has been taught to play. The hidden pleasure spot that often remains unknown to women carries a weight that is more than physical. It is symbolic. It represents the point where a man's carefully constructed image collides with his deeper, often unacknowledged self. This hidden sensitivity is not just about nerve endings or the body's capacity to respond. It is about what it means for a man to release control, to lay aside the armor of identity, and to risk being encountered in a state that society often tells him is unacceptable: vulnerability. Men are taught to link their sense of worth with control, with the ability to dominate their own bodies, their emotions, and even their desires. To lose control, even in intimacy, can be experienced as a threat to the identity they have spent years building. Yet it is precisely in the loss of control, in the surrender to something greater than performance, that the hidden pleasure spot takes on its meaning. When a man allows himself to experience this deeper form of pleasure, he is not simply responding physically. He is affirming something about his identity that goes beyond social roles. He is saying, even if unconsciously, that he is more than the mask of strength and more than the persona that has been required of him. He is acknowledging that within him exists a softer, more tender dimension that does not erase his masculinity, but completes it. The hidden spot becomes then a symbol of reconciliation. It reconciles the man he presents to the world with the man he hides within himself. It reconciles his need for control with his longing to surrender. It reconciles the physical with the psychological, the body with the soul. To be touched in this way is not merely an act of stimulation, but an act of recognition, one that tells him that he can exist in his entirety and still be desired, This is why the hidden pleasure spot is not just a physical secret, but a psychological one, because what it truly represents is the capacity to be seen as a whole being rather than a fragmented image of masculinity. The act of a woman discovering and awakening this hidden sensitivity becomes more than just a physical interaction. It is a mirror held up to the man's identity. It challenges him to confront the parts of himself he has ignored, repressed, or hidden. The pleasure he feels is not only in the body but in the liberation from the constant need to perform. It is the pleasure of being allowed to dissolve into authenticity, to step outside of the rigid lines of identity and into the fluid, vulnerable, unguarded space of true intimacy. For many men, this is both exhilarating and terrifying, because in surrendering to it, they risk exposing the self they fear will not be accepted. Yet when it is accepted, the reward is profound, for it validates not only their desire but their entire being. To see the hidden pleasure spot only as a matter of anatomy is to miss the greater truth it reveals. It is not simply about arousal, but about identity, not simply about sensation, but about meaning. A man touched here is not just pleasured, he is understood. He is no longer trapped in the narrow expectations of what his pleasure should look like, but is free to discover dimensions of himself that have long been silenced. This discovery is transformative, for it shifts intimacy from something mechanical into something existential, from something external into something that reaches the deepest recesses of his being. In this way, the hidden pleasure spot is both a physical and a symbolic threshold. It is the point at which the man ceases to be only a performer of desire and becomes instead a participant in the deeper union of body and spirit. His identity, often confined by social constructs, expands in this moment to include his vulnerability, his receptivity, his capacity to yield. What he discovers is that pleasure is not the enemy of strength, but the companion of authenticity, and that in allowing himself to be touched in ways he has never allowed before, he reclaims the parts of himself he did not know were missing. In this union of pleasure and identity, the man is not diminished but completed, for he learns that his truest power lies not in resisting surrender, but in embracing it. The number one male pleasure spot that so many women overlook cannot be reduced to a simple act of touch, because its essence lies in the union of physical sensation with psychological and emotional connection. It is a place where the body alone is not enough, where stimulation without presence feels empty, and where the most profound experience comes only when touch and recognition are fused together. To awaken this hidden dimension, a woman must understand that a man's body is not a machine that responds to predictable triggers, but an instrument tuned by emotion, memory, and unconscious longing. The body may respond mechanically to touch, but the depth of his pleasure depends on the presence of a connection that affirms his vulnerability, his humanity, and his longing to be accepted. Without this, even the most skilled technique remains shallow, but with it, even the most subtle touch can open pathways to sensations he did not know he could feel. What distinguishes this hidden pleasure spot is that it is not located only in the body but also in the psyche. The male body, conditioned for performance and control, often resists revealing its most delicate responses. This resistance is not merely physical, but psychological, born from years of training that tell men their role is to act, to pursue, to dominate, and never to yield. Yet the very spot that holds the deepest potential for pleasure is also the one that requires yielding, surrender, and trust. When a man feels both physically stimulated and emotionally recognized, the tension between control and vulnerability dissolves, and in that dissolution, the hidden spot awakens fully. This is why physical touch without psychological awareness fails to access its depths. It may trigger sensation, but it does not create the transformative experience of union. The merging of body and psyche in this hidden sensitivity reveals that intimacy is never only about what is touched, but about how it is touched, and more importantly, about who the man becomes in the moment of being touched. The body alone craves sensation, but the psyche craves acknowledgement. And when these two longings are met simultaneously, the pleasure is magnified into something far beyond the physical. It becomes a confirmation of his existence, a validation that he can be seen without masks and still be embraced. This is what most women overlook, that the hidden spot is less a secret patch of skin than it is a convergence of physical and psychological realities, an intersection where his need for sensation and his need for acceptance meet. When this convergence occurs, when the woman's touch carries presence, gentleness, and genuine desire, the man experiences something he rarely encounters, a complete alignment between his physical body and his inner being. The masculine tendency to compartmentalize dissolves, and he no longer feels divided between the one who performs and the one who secretly longs to surrender. In this state, his body ceases to resist, his unconscious fears of shame or ridicule fade, and the hidden pleasure spot responds with an intensity that surprises even him. The sensation is not simply a matter of nerves firing. It is a release of guarded energy, a moment in which years of repression yield to trust. This union transforms touch into a sacred act, because it does not merely arouse but reveals. The symbolism of this hidden spot is profound. It stands as a reminder that pleasure for men is not shallow, not limited to the obvious, and not detached from the soul. It symbolizes the truth that the deepest experiences cannot be accessed without vulnerability, that pleasure without connection leaves emptiness, but pleasure with connection leads to transformation. A woman who understands this does not approach her partner mechanically but with reverence, recognizing that she holds in her hands not just a body, but a psyche that longs for acknowledgement. In doing so, she bridges the false divide between the physical and the emotional, creating a space where intimacy becomes whole. Thus, the number one male pleasure spot women do not know about is not simply hidden in anatomy, but in the way body and mind interlace. It cannot be reached through technique alone, but requires a presence that speaks to his unconscious, assuring him that his surrender will not be mocked, that his vulnerability will not be betrayed. In such a space, touch becomes more than touch. It becomes a dialogue, a communication that says he is free to be without pretense, free to abandon control, free to feel in the totality of his being. It is in this convergence of touch and recognition, sensation and safety, body and soul, that the hidden spot reveals itself fully, transforming ordinary pleasure into an experience of union where the masculine discovers that he is not only strong when he resists, but even stronger when he surrenders to the fullness of intimacy. The number one male pleasure spot women do not know about is not only hidden in his body but hidden in his being. It is the meeting point of trust and sensation, the union of vulnerability and desire, the symbolic doorway where identity yields to authenticity. To awaken it is not to learn a mechanical trick, but to cultivate a presence that sees beyond the surface, that touches not just skin but soul, that recognizes the man not as a performer but as a whole human longing to be received. This hidden sensitivity shows that male pleasure, far from being shallow, is deeply tied to safety, trust, and the courage to surrender. When women approach with patience and reverence, they do more than unlock physical responses. They awaken a man to his truest self, to the parts of him that have long remained silent. And in that awakening, intimacy ceases to be an act and becomes a revelation, where body and soul unite in a depth of pleasure that transforms both.